Venezuela is witnessing the largest exodus in Latin America's recent history, and one of the largest displacement crises worldwide, with over 8 million Venezuelans fleeing the country. Many have sought refuge in the United States, where the Biden administration granted them temporary protected status. This has strained the US economy and allowed a notorious Venezuelan gang to operate within American borders, escalating violent crime. At the heart of the crisis is the dictatorial regime of Nicolás Maduro and the horrific humanitarian conditions in Venezuela, where 75% of the population now lives in extreme poverty. With Donald Trump now set to return to office, he's addressed the issue of Venezuelan migrants, laying blame on Joe Biden's border policies, and announcing plans for a deportation operation larger than Eisenhower's infamous Operation Wetback. Yet many aren't aware that Trump's former administration shares a complicity in Venezuela's crisis. Guided by war hawks, they pursued a covert operation to oust Maduro, a mission that ended in disaster, leaving a region destabilized and millions in despair. Believe it or not, Venezuela once had one of the world's wealthiest economies. After the discovery of oil in the Maracaibo Basin in the 1920s, Venezuela rapidly rose to become a global oil powerhouse. By the 1950s, it was the largest oil exporter and a critical supplier to the United States. Fast forward to today, and the story is vastly different. Venezuela's economy has shrunk drastically, with crumbling infrastructure and a population struggling to get by. However, the cause was not purely socialism, as suggested by Ben Shapiro. Economic mismanagement, particularly under Hugo Chavez, made oil a dangerous lifeline. Instead of diversifying, the government poured everything into oil. When prices crashed, so did the economy. Following Chavez's death in 2013, Nicolás Maduro took power, doubling down on oil dependency for nearly 95% of export revenue. In 2014, the economic collapse led to widespread poverty, sparking protests that Maduro countered with violent crackdowns. Many Venezuelans fled to nearby countries, driven by desperation. In 2018, the former bus driver turned autocrat secured re-election in a widely criticized, allegedly fraudulent vote. As anti-government protests again erupted across the petrostate, millions of Venezuelans fled, triggering a regional refugee crisis. In the United States, then-President Donald Trump floated the idea of a possible military operation against Maduro. On September 26, Trump addressed the United Nations, condemning Venezuela's crisis as a human tragedy and announcing further sanctions. In response, Maduro took the UN stage, asserting that Venezuela was the victim of permanent aggression by the imperialist United States. He even accused the Trump administration of orchestrating a recent assassination attempt against him, a claim later disproven when a Venezuelan military member took responsibility. On January 23, 2019, opposition leader Juan Guaido, backed by Venezuela's National Assembly, stood before a massive crowd in Caracas and raised his right hand, declaring himself interim president. He vowed to restore the constitution, which Maduro was widely accused of violating during his second term. This move led US National Security Advisor John Bolton, as he later detailed in his memoir, to believe the US needed to support Guaido in unseating Maduro. Bolstered by administration allies like UN Ambassador Nikki Haley, Bolton advocated for action. the administration publicly framed its stance as a humanitarian mission. Of course, this justification was as dubious as the Bush administration's concern over Kurdish persecution under Saddam Hussein. In reality, the support aligned with multiple US interests. Influential Venezuelan American communities strongly opposed Maduro. The mounting Venezuelan migration crisis strained US resources, and Maduro's alliances with US adversaries heightened the stakes. Concluding that covert intervention was likely the only viable route, the administration moved forward with plans to help remove Maduro from power. In late January, the Trump administration recognized Guaido as Venezuela's rightful acting leader and imposed the toughest sanctions yet, targeting the state-owned oil company and freezing billions in Venezuelan state assets. Around that time, the CIA swiftly assembled a Venezuela task force to hack government networks and infrastructure. Although they faced resistance from top Pentagon officials, they proceeded with a cyber attack on the state payroll system responsible for paying Venezuela's military. The aim was to sway military officials toward Guaido by amplifying the regime's failures. While the delayed paychecks had some effect, it wasn't enough. The CIA then deployed pro-democracy content online in Venezuela and supported local civic groups, hoping to stir greater anti-Maduro sentiment. But why would a population struggling with hunger, power outages, unemployment, and a lack of medicine care about democracy? Trump administration officials shared this skepticism. They described the CIA's efforts as embarrassing and lazy. Some believed the agency was prioritizing democracy promotion to avoid more aggressive operations. John Bolton told Wired, "The CIA is not the Mossad. It's hunkered down, bureaucratic, and not daring." In fact, CIA officials, including CIA Director Gina Haspel, were opposed to the administration's directive, reportedly still scarred by the Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961, and influenced by the Obama administration's belief that there were no enemies in Latin America. Still, the warhawks continued to push the CIA and Pentagon to take combative actions. They decided to target oil shipments leaving Venezuela for Cuba, hoping to strike a blow against two socialist regimes. The CIA had a mobile system capable of covertly disabling ships, but it turned out that the system was located in another hemisphere, and the agency was not willing to relocate it. The plan was abandoned. At one point, Colombia stepped in to assist, drawing on its long-standing collaboration with CIA and Pentagon paramilitary forces. The Colombian team agreed to conduct an operation within Venezuela, aimed at disabling some of the Venezuelan Air Force's prized Russian-made fighter jets, with the US providing intelligence on target locations. However, according to a former senior official, the operation fell short, with only a small number of aircrafts being successfully disabled. As days passed, John Bolton worked to keep Trump focused on ousting Maduro. But despite wanting to replace the socialist regime, Trump began losing confidence in Guaido, calling him weak and not up for the job. Fractures within the administration deepened, even by the standards of the neocons. Bolton's strategy was seen as overly aggressive. Eventually, officials created a task force dedicated to Venezuela, bringing together the CIA, State, Treasury, and Defense departments. Notably absent from the group were Bolton and his National Security Council allies. Unlike Bolton, the task force sought to avoid operations that could lead to blowback for the CIA. In March, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo ordered the closure of the US Embassy in Caracas. The reasoning remains unclear, but some officials cited credible threats of violence against embassy personnel by the Maduro regime. Regardless, the move had disastrous consequences for US intelligence gathering in Venezuela and severely hampered the coup efforts. After numerous delays, Guaido's plan to oust Maduro was finally set to launch on April 30th, 2019. On that day, Guaido declared Operation Liberty, urging military defections and widespread protests. The Trump administration felt Maduro was on the verge of surrendering, possibly even fleeing to Cuba. But things unraveled fast. Miscommunication and distrust among key opposition figures and hesitant Maduro supporters caused last-minute backtracking by major Venezuelan officials. The expected mass military defections never happened. The High Court backed out, and the protests fizzled. With Cuban security forces at his side, Maduro rallied his supporters, shifting the tide against regime change. Despite ongoing efforts from the Venezuelan opposition and the Trump administration, their strongest chance had slipped away. The operation's utter failure only poured salt on the wound it aimed to heal. Many analysts argue that US sanctions inadvertently strengthened Maduro's grip on power. The dictator used the US as a scapegoat for Venezuela's suffering, rallying nationalist support and bolstering loyalty among both citizens and military forces. With access to legitimate global oil markets blocked, Venezuela turned to alternative, often illicit revenue sources, tightening its economic control and strengthening ties with countries like Russia, China, and Iran. These alliances helped Maduro circumvent sanctions through opaque oil deals and financial support. As hyperinflation worsened, millions of Venezuelans fled, placing immense pressure on neighboring countries. When the Biden administration took office, it adopted a new approach. In October 2023, driven by rising gasoline prices due to the Russia-Ukraine war and a growing refugee crisis, Biden struck a deal with Maduro. In exchange for Maduro's commitment to hold free and fair presidential elections in July 2024 and accept deported Venezuelan refugees, the US agreed to ease some of the Trump-era sanctions on Venezuela's energy sector. Maduro quickly reneged on the deal. His government disqualified key opposition candidates and launched a sweeping anti-democratic crackdown. 6 months later, the Biden administration reinstated oil sanctions. This past July, Maduro declared victory in a vote once again tainted by widespread fraud. So what does the future hold in this precarious situation? Just a week ago, Nicolás Maduro congratulated Donald Trump on his victory in the presidential election, calling for a new era of dialogue and respect between the two nations. Trump, in return, has shown little interest in the confrontational stance his first term took toward Venezuela. With a mass deportation plan looming, he may even need Maduro's cooperation. This next term could signal a shift towards a more cooperative relationship with Venezuela. But a darker reality may be unfolding. Trump's recent appointment of neocons like Senator Marco Rubio signals the possibility of a far more aggressive approach. The stage is set for potential escalation. With past United States interventions mired by poor coordination, wavering allies, and ill-considered sanctions, the consequences have only deepened the crisis. Another wave of intervention could plunge Venezuela into an even greater catastrophe, one that might destabilize the entire region. Beware of such foreign policy.